Let's talk about grabbing objects in VR. And in order to grab things, we're going to need to know how to use two components, that being the XR Grab Interactable and the XR Direct Interactor. As always, I want to cover as much as possible in the smallest amount of time, so let's get started. Opening up the project, you'll see here I haven't really added anything new. I do have this new object here that I'll go over later in the video, but yeah, we have the XR origin, and then we have our left and right hand controllers. Let's kick things off by adding a XR Direct Interact. To do that, all we have to do is select our two controllers here, and I'm going to type in XR Direct Interactor. And there we go. We have the XR Direct Interactor, but it's also going to need some form of collider that's going to act as a trigger. Without that, this will not work. So I'm going to add a sphere collider and expand this out. I'm going to set it to is trigger, and then we have a pretty big radius here. So we need to reduce it down, and you know what? I'm just going to grab the hand model for a reference. Let's see, where is my, yeah, let's go with the right hand. I'll just drag this into the scene, make sure it's zeroed out. All right, and so I'm going to take this radius and reduce it. I'm going to try 0.1. And you see, that is just about the right size. You know, you could try something like 0.08 if you want it to be a little more exact for when your hand interacts with an object. And then we just have to make sure that we do this for the left hand as well. Yeah, you know, I like 0.08 a little better. And then I'm just going to get rid of this reference. So with that, let's go over the Direct Interactor. Looking through some of these components, you can see we have an interaction manager. So that is going to be handling the interaction between our interactor, which is going to be our hand, and then the interactable, which will be the objects that we can pick up. Next, we have an interaction layer mask. So we might not want to interact with every single object in the scene. Sometimes you want your UI components to just interact with UI components. And so this is where we would add a layer to separate these interactions. And you just clicked add layer, and we could add one here called interactable. Coming back to our hand. So, you know, I could say, I don't want this to interact with anything. I only want things to interact with the interactable layer. And then down here, we have an attach transform. So if you do not have anything here, and this is set to none, it's just going to use the transform of the XR Direct Interactor, which I'm okay with right now. We also have select action trigger. So this would determine how our select starts. So it's kind of interesting. So state change is how you would expect. You know, you go down, you grab an object, and then when you pick it up, you know, you're holding the grip button, but when you release it, it drops. The other ones we have is state. So how state works is when you go in and you are holding the button, even if you are not interacting with the object, if you ran into it while holding the grip button, it would pick it up, which is kind of a weird interaction, but there it is. We also have toggle and sticky. And toggle and sticky are very similar in the sense that you would be hovering over a object, and when it's toggle, you can press the grip button or whatever your activation button is, and then when you release it, it'll still stay on you. But when you press it again, then it will release. And how sticky works is the same way, but it only lets go of the object when you let go for the second time. So yeah, there you go. A few options on how you can pick up your objects. We also have hide controller on select. And you know what? I'm going to select both my left and right hand controller, and I'm just going to check that. So if you don't have a custom animation or dynamic grabbing for your objects, it kind of looks a little wonky. The hand will go right through the object. And personally, I like to hide the controller on select. But you know, actually, for demonstration purposes later, I'm going to check this off for now. We also have the odd choice right here of starting selected interactable. So if we boot up the scene and had something here, if we had something that was a XR Grab Interactable, then this would just start off in our hand at the beginning of the scene. So say you want the player just to have a gun in their hand at the beginning, this is where you could put that. And finally, we have a bunch of events here, audio events, haptic events, and interactor events that we can use when we pick up our objects. But we don't have any objects to pick up, so let's fix that. Now, in order to grab things, we need grab interactables and, well, just objects to grab them. So I am going to activate this and show you what I've done here. And as you can see, I'm actually going to hide these for now. All I have here is a table. And the table is just comprised of a cube that I made. I put a 0.5 position and scale of 1. And yeah, this is just a simple little table so we can grab onto things. And you'll see the XR origin is right here. So when we start up the scene, we'll be looking at this table and be able to grab things off it. And well, let's make a grab interactable. So to do that, we need to right click, grab a 3D cube. I am going to reduce this to, let's see, 0.2. might be a good size. Yeah, just for now. And there we go. Next, we need to add a, well, Grab Interactable component to it. So I'm going to come over here, add XR Grab Interactable. And one thing I want to point out is you'll notice that it added a rigid body right here. XR Grab Interactables will not work without a rigid body, kind of like how our hands will not work without a sphere collider set to trigger or any collider set to trigger. We need to have a rigid body on our XR Grab Interactables and also some form of collider as well. One thing I'll point out about the rigid body is you might want to up the collision detection. So I'm going to set this to continuous dynamic, and this is going to be a little more expensive than doing something like discrete or continuous, but it does help prevent objects from flying through the ground when they're going at higher speeds. If you're ever having those problems where the colliders aren't really picking things up, you might want to consider continuous dynamic. Expanding this out, let's go over some things for the Grab Interact. You'll see here that it has the interaction manager from before, the one that is responsible for handling our interactions between our interactables and interactors. We also have the interaction layer mask, and this is set to default. And if you'll remember just a second ago, I set this to only interactable. So we need to make sure that this is set to the proper one. So I'm going to, where is it? There we go. And there we go. I'm going to set it to interactable, take it off default. We also have different types of select mode. So there is single and multiple. Just for this one, I'm just going to cover single. We'll cover multiple hand grabbing objects later. We have a gaze configuration, which, well, I can't afford the Oculus Pro or any other eye tracking device, so I can't cover it. Sorry. But hey, I do have a Patreon if you want to help me out with that. Patreon plug. Seriously though, just a like would be enough if you're finding this video helpful. But yeah, all right, let's move on. We also have different movement types. I will cover this in a second. We also can determine if we want the object to track or not. So if we don't want it to track, let's say the position, we could turn that off here. Or if you want the rotation of the object to be maintained, so even though we're turning our controllers, then if we turn this off, it wouldn't turn with it, it just moves the position. We can also decide to smooth this out, and so this kind of gives you a bit of a floaty feel that you can play with. Same with the rotation. We also have a ton of options when it comes to throwing, and so we can determine if we want to throw and detach or just drop it immediately and not track the velocity, and we can play with this later. I'm going to try to make a video that perfects throwing because, well, for the Game Jam, I made a game where you primarily throw things, and God, did I hate my throwing. But right. And then we have attach transforms where we can specifically say where I pick up an object, I want you to attach exactly at this location. And I will cover that in just 1 second. Now, I know I keep saying 1 second and that 1 second has passed. So let's cover what the movement types are. So I'm going to go ahead and click this off. And I'm going to activate these 3 cubes. And as you can see here, there's nothing crazy going on. I've just put a little canvas on these to symbolize what these are going to stand for. And so what we have here is a cube with kinematic, instantaneous, and velocity tracking movement. And if I start up the scene, you'll see when I grab the instantaneous cube, it moves instantly with my hand, but when I push it through the table, it goes right through. And that's because it disables the rigid body on it. And the same with the kinematic, but the kinematic has kind of a bit of a floatiness to it. It lags behind, but still goes through the table. And finally, we have velocity tracking, which has that lagging, but also stops when you try to push it through the table. And yeah, that is all of them. Booping back to the project, I think it's important to mention the attach transform. And how this essentially works is we'd have to create an empty object here. I'm going to call it attach transform. Or actually even better, since this one's a little long, I'm going to choose the velocity tracking one. You know, I'm going to go with attach point. I like that name better. And so if we see here, this is going to be zeroed out on our velocity tracking object. And what we want to keep in mind is we want to make sure that this is set to local and that the rotation is correct here. And what I mean by that is the x-axis, this red axis, should be pointed towards the palm of our hand. The y-axis should be pointed towards where we consider the top, and then the z should be pointed forwards. Now, for this example, let's say I want the top of this surface to be pointing forwards, I want the v to be pointing upwards, and then I want this to be pointing towards my palm. So I would switch to rotation, and I would adjust those accordingly. My bad, I have the wrong thing selected. It's the attach point that we need to rotate. All right, so now we have the y-axis that is pointing upwards, and so my V should be pointing upwards, and then the X is pointed towards my palm, and then this should be pointing forwards when I pick it up. Now, the last thing I need to make sure I do is make sure that I set the attach point. So I'm going to come over here, I'm going to drag that there, and then let's boot up the scene. Now, as you see, when I pick it up, the V points upward because the Y position was there. The X points towards the palm of my hand, and the Z points forward. Next, we need to look at interactable events. And so these are events where, well, if you imagine, the interactor comes in contact with our interactable. So that could be it hovering, that could be it selecting it or deselecting it. And we can use these to do things like when we hover over it, maybe change the mesh so the player knows that the object is interactable. And we could also do things like when we select it, maybe you want to make that item active. So maybe it turns on a shield for the player. And then, you know, if we go over to the XR Direct Interactor, we also have the same kind of events that we can play with. But even more so, we have these events. So we have audio events that we can trigger and haptic events. So on select entered, you might want to add in an audio clip and play a sound for the player. Or when we come over here, we might want to do haptic events. This is really important for immersion. So again, when they're selecting, when you grab something in real life, you kind of have a tactile response. And this little vibration and duration that you can add here is going to let the player know that, okay, they've grabbed something. And based on if it's a heavier object, maybe you want it to have a very intense haptic feedback. Now, when it comes to interacting with objects, you know the basics of it. As always, I love you, my Patreon members, and I hope you found this useful, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.